Recency bias always plays a huge role in Dynasty fantasy football, and we are coming off an absolutely crazy NFL season. So in today's video, we are going to break down 5 players who you need to sell high on right now because they could be at their absolute peak value. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying any of these players are necessarily going to decline this year or in general are players that you don't want on your dynasty rosters, but if you're rebuilding or looking for absolute gold in trade value, I think right now is the highest overall value that you will get for these players in terms of trade value. So at least consider moving them because we have some big names in today's video. All right, let's start with Jackson Smith-Njigba, coming off of a season where he finished as the wide receiver 2 in fantasy. There is no denying that he is one of the most valued overall players, regardless of position in dynasty leagues, finishing with nearly 1,800 receiving yards off of 119 receptions and 10 touchdowns. And once again, he had an absolutely dominant season. There's nothing to not like here, but let's take a little bit of a look ahead at what Seattle's offense could potentially look like this coming season, right? Clinton Kubiak headed to the Raiders. This offense is going to be running under an entirely new system. And at the end of the day, I don't really necessarily think that's particularly going to be bad for Jackson Smith-Njigba, but it's at least something to think about. There could be potential decline coming for this Seahawks offense next year. So, in general, when we're looking at what Jackson Smith-Njigba did, so dominant, there's going to be some slight regression from a wide receiver to finish. It is likely we're going to see regression in the coming fantasy season. And once again, we are discussing selling players based on potential peak value. And this is probably the highest finish at the wide receiver position that we are going to see in JSN's career. Could be wrong, but I think it's very likely. We look over the last 5 seasons. I know we're not looking at, the number 1 wide receiver in fantasy this past year. When we talk about JSN, that would be Puka Nacua, who finished as the wide receiver 1 in fantasy this past year. But when we look at the last 5 wide receivers to finish number 1 overall in fantasy, not including this year, we have Jamar Chase, CeeDee Lamb, Justin Jefferson, Cooper Kupp, and Davante Adams. Now, most of those names at the top there, Chase, Lamb, Jefferson, still very valuable in dynasty circles for obvious reason, but we have seen some overall regression from players like JJ and CeeDee Lamb, and especially from names like Cooper Kupp and Davante Adams. Now, Chase, Lamb, Jefferson, these guys are still plenty valuable in dynasty fantasy football, but you're not necessarily selling those players for the same value that you were after their wide receiver 1 finish. So all I'm saying is test the waters, see what's out there. If you own JSN, maybe even if you own Puka Nacua, right, there could be changes to these offensive systems, to the quarterback situation when we're looking at Puka Nacua. Just overall, I don't know if we're going to see anything other than some slight regression out of what was a very dominant year for those 2 wide receivers, but specifically Jackson Smith-Njigba. And as history tells, we do see some slight overall decrease in value. So yes, JSN would love to have him on any roster, love having him on rosters out there in my dynasty leagues, and I don't really trade cornerstone dynasty pieces, but if you're going to make that move, now is the time to do so, because once again, that value is going to be as high as you will ever see it, more than likely. All right, let's move from a Super Bowl winner to a Super Bowl loser and discuss Drake May, who finished as the quarterback 2 in fantasy this past year with nearly 4,400 passing yards, 31 passing touchdowns, as well as 450 rushing yards and 4 rushing touchdowns. May was great in his sophomore season, not denying that in any way, shape, or form, but he's become one of the hottest names at the quarterback position in dynasty communities, specifically in superflex formats. And even with the Super Bowl performance now kind of being held over his head, nobody's really doubting what he did fantasy-wise this past year, but there's still some uncertainty around his offensive line and aging wide receiver room that could be upgraded in the off season. Just kind of like outside of the running back position and maybe like Hunter Henry at tight end, so offensive line and wide receiver, there's just a little bit of a question mark of what the makeup of this offense is really going to look like going into next year. And then we have the potential Super Bowl slump slapping this team across the face. Once again, you have to expect some sort of regression out of a player like Drake May at the quarterback position. We've seen other quarterbacks have some early success in their year in terms of fantasy output and then kind of fizzle off. And I'm not saying that Drake May, is going to turn to this quarterback that's just completely worthless. But at the end of the day, once again, we're looking for peak maximum value, a QB2 finish this past year for Drake May. I don't know if he's going to top that once again. He's still as young as he's going to be in dynasty circles. And once again, I just have a little bit of a worry that we could see regression coming pretty swiftly here for Drake May and the Patriots offense as a whole. So consider what you can get out there. Go test the waters. I think in terms of selling Drake May at max value, now is the time to do so. And very quickly, if you guys are new to the channel, do us a huge favor, hit that subscribe button down below. We are trying to get to 1,000 subscribers as quickly as we can here on the channel, and we are this close. We are putting out weekly Dynasty Fantasy Football content to help you guys dominate the Dynasty Fantasy season. So if you guys get any sort of value whatsoever out of today's video, we'd greatly appreciate it. Just take one quick second, hit that subscribe button down below. All right, next up, let's take a look at George Pickens of the Dallas Cowboys. It's almost easy to forget that George Pickens finished as a top 5 wide receiver in fantasy this past year, with over 1,400 receiving yards and 9 receiving touchdowns. But now we're kind of back in the off-season area of the George Pickens panic. And, I'm not somebody who's particularly worried about George Pickens, but we have to kind of evaluate a couple of things, right? CeeDee Lamb missed some time this past year, missed 4 total games. George Pickens was pretty dominant throughout that stretch. And don't get me wrong, even when CeeDee Lamb did return, George Pickens was still dominant. I actually think CeeDee Lamb being on the field was a good thing for Pickens in terms of, opposing defenses and facing opposing defenses. But still, now we're kind of in this place. Is George Pickens going to get traded? Is he going to hold out for a new contract? And if he is on another team next year, would he still be dominant, in a system that isn't overly heavy in terms of a passing offense like Dallas was this past year? And then what does it really look like if he's on a team that does not have CeeDee Lamb lining up as the wide receiver one? Now, like I said, George Pickens had plenty of success even when CeeDee Lamb was off the field, but at the same time, you have to imagine that defenses going into next year will at least be able to somewhat be able to adapt to that, right? So listen, when it comes to a player like George Pickens who's facing, the potential to hold out from his team and really hold out for that long-term contract, if this turns into one of those situations where there's kind of drama left and right and we don't exactly know what's going, we're getting closer and closer to the NFL season starting and we don't really know what's going on with George Pickens, maybe like a Brandon Ayuk type of situation, then I do think there could be some panic that really settles in for the Dynasty community when we're talking about a player who already just takes a lot of shots for his character and off the field and whatever it is, right, with George Pickens. So, he kind of gets labeled as a drama king and all that stuff. And if we start to get into one of these off-season drama situations, all I'm saying is that the sooner you trade him, probably the better for max potential value out there on the trade market. Now, I personally am not too worried about George Pickens. I still think he's an uberly talented player, but the situation will matter here in my eyes. So all I'm saying is test the waters, maybe a little bit closer to the NFL draft when, more people in your Dynasty leagues starting to put their thinking caps on and not just us Dynasty nerds out here that are already studying. But when it comes to George Pickens, all I'm saying, once again, is that we might be looking at peak potential trade value right now. So go ahead and test the waters before the drama really potentially hits. All right, let's move to a running back, and we're talking about the king himself, Derrick Henry. And I can't believe I'm going to make this argument. Being a longtime Derrick Henry supporter in Dynasty communities, right? But we all know that the running back position has become more replaceable than any other position in fantasy football. And while Henry was still a top 8 fantasy football running back this past year, and outside of an injured season in 2021, he has been a top 8 running back in fantasy football every year since 2019. I mean, he is the king for a reason, right? He's also had over 280 touches in every single one of those seasons, and that wear and tear has to be coming soon because in 7 of those 8 seasons, he's had 300 or more total carries. He's age 32. He's going into his 11th season. I know we hear this argument about Derrick Henry like every single offseason. And if you guys, know me and have followed me through my fantasy football content, you guys know that I have been one of the people out here who's consistently just brushed that off and has said, you always draft Derrick Henry when it comes to fantasy football. But we're talking dynasty here. We're talking long-term, and the long-term seems to be running out. Plus, we have a new coaching staff here, new offense, new philosophy. Maybe we start to see some sprinkles of some younger running backs mixed in here. I don't know if that's necessarily going to be awful for Derrick Henry. I think he can still dominate at the goal line, but there is the potential here for an offensive philosophy change at the end of the day with a entirely new coaching staff coming in. And the important thing here is that I still think you can get a first-round pick for Derrick Henry. If you guys were following the channel, during the actual season, I was telling you if you are not contending and you own Derrick Henry, sell him to a contender for a first during the season. But now we're out of the season, so the value is going to be a little bit depleted here. But I still think you can get a first-round draft pick, even if it's a mid-draft pick or late draft pick or 2028 draft pick, whatever it's going to be, for Derrick Henry. So do so right now, especially if you are rebuilding or in general, if you are looking for the max potential trade value for Derrick Henry. You got to go ahead and pull the trigger now while you can. All right, we began the video with the Seahawk. Let's end the video with another Seahawk and talk about A.J. Barner at the tight end position, who was a pleasant surprise for dynasty owners if you didn't grab him off the waiver wire, finishing as a top 15 tight end this past year in fantasy football. He hit double-digit PPR fantasy points 8 times on the season, finishing the year with 52 catches, 519 receiving yards, 6 receiving touchdowns. So we're not talking about like crazy value or anything here when it comes to A.J. Barner, but I think that recency bias is like really set in here. He had the big touchdown in the Super Bowl, had a good game overall in the Super Bowl. The Seahawks, hot, flashy team because they just won the Super Bowl in a dominant way, right? Very good throughout the course of the playoffs, all of that. And this, once again, might just be A.J. Barner's peak value when it comes to the potential to trade him. I think this is a really good potential example of peak value. And now, once again, this offensive system going to look very different next year. No Clint Kubiak. Maybe that's good for Barner. Maybe it's not. Maybe we see more involvement out of young tight end Elijah Arroyo. So, once again, we're looking for peak value. If you own A.J. Barner, this is probably the least valuable player in today's video, but go ahead and test the waters, see what you could get for him. I am a fan of him. This is not a player that, you spent high draft capital on, or maybe even got him off the waivers, all of that stuff. So if you're tempted to hold him, see what happens, I can't really blame you. But once again, the recency bias is going to be very strong here in terms of the potential to trade him at peak value. And that was the purpose of today's videos. You're selling these players now if and only you're looking to get the maximum potential value out of those players. And I think at the end of the day, when it comes to these tight end premium leagues, people tend to have these situations where they value or overvalue the tight end position at times. You can probably get very good value out of A.J. Barner, or maybe combine them with a draft pick for even a potential better tight end overall. So just go test the waters, see what's out there. Once again, I think A.J. Barner is a player to sell now because he could be at his true peak value. Hey, you guys have it. 5 players to trade right now if you are looking to trade them for absolute gold mines. Like I said at the beginning of the video, don't forget to hit that subscribe button on the way out. Help us get to 1,000 subscribers. Maybe we can do it with this video. We are right around the corner. If you want to check out any of the other amazing Dynasty content that we have been putting out on the channel, you can do so by checking all of it out on the playlist right here.